Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from, and welcome to this Istanbul Innovation Days 2021 keynote conversation about power and change in development. Today, we feature two remarkable women who speak from the trenches on what does it take to shift power dynamics and question existing assumptions that perpetuate inequalities in very different political and socioeconomic contexts, but with some very apparent patterns that emerge across from their experience. Why is this relevant now? COVID-19 has triggered, among others, a radical rethink of development, its role in replicating past hierarchies, undermining local agency, and overshadowing local efforts to respond to crises. As we've seen, social protests that took center stage in 2020 mainly focused on systemic weaknesses and inequities that the pandemic has both revealed and made worse, but also kickstarted a process of soul-searching among the development organizations and sector to challenge previous assumptions about foreign aid, from who donates money and who should get paid to deliver aid, to whose knowledge and what metrics matter in determining what success looks like. So what insights can development sector take from social justice movements in US and Sudan and their efforts to question inherent patterns of the past that prevent us from thinking and acting differently and seeing new possibilities? We will dig into this question with Alaa, Salah, a women's rights activist who became the symbol of the 2019 revolution in Sudan, and Alicia, Garza, the principal of the Black Futures Lab and previously a co-founder of Black Lives Matter movement. Alaa, it is great to have you at the Istanbul Innovation Days. Thanks for your time and willingness to have this conversation with us. I would like to start with something that I read in Alicia's book. She says that hashtags don't build movements, people build movements, and you cannot sustain a movement with anger and grief. Does your experience resonate with that? What changes do you see in the region that both make you hopeful and scared for the future of women in this part of the world?
بتفق مع إليشيا في الهاشتاج ما ببني حركة. الحركة هي already بتكون مبنية، والإيمان بالقضية هو اللي بيساعد الحركة إنها تتبني وإنها تستمر. إذا عايزين نسقط المسمى الكلام اللي هي قالته ده على التجربة السودانية، بنلقى إنه الثورة بدايتها من شهر 12 في 2018 كانت مستمرة، وإحنا كنا بنطلع على الشارع باستمرار وبنردد في شعاراتنا وبننادي بكل الشعارات اللي إحنا بنقولها. فالخلى الثورة تستمر الهاشتاج 200 ساعدنا. بعد اعتصام القيادة العامة، يمكن من الهاشتاجات الرئيسية كانت بعد الصورة اللي اتأخذت لي اللي هو حبوبتي كان ده كان هاشتاج من الهاشتاجات الرئيسية سلطت الضوء على الثورة. فإذا الحركة هي already كانت مبنية وكانت مستمرة. الهاشتاج جه ساعد في إنه الثورة تظهر للعالم. فإذا بنرجع للنقطة بإنه هو بيساعد في تسليط الضوء، وبيساعد في إنه الناس تركز في حدث معين في المكان الفلاني من العالم، لكن ما بيبني. هو already الحركة بتكون مبنية، الثورة بتكون مبنية، التظاهرات وكل الحاجة دي هي بتكون مستمرة، والهاشتاج بيساعد في إنها كيف تتوثق وكيف تصل للعالم. زيادة على ذلك، في شهر 6 بعد فض مجزرة القيادة العامة كان في هاشتاج المرة دي كان عكسي من العالم تضامنا مع السودان. يعني كل الهاشتاجات ممكن كان بتطلع من السودان عشان العالم يعرف إنه في حركة في ثورة في السودان. بس هاشتاج بلو فور سودان هو كان تضامن من العالم معنا في السودان. فكانت حركة عكسية. بنشوف إنه الهاشتاج كيف ساعد في إنه يسلط الضوء، خصوصاً في شهر 6 كان النت منقطع تماماً من السودان بعد أحداث فض الاعتصام. فبلو فور سودان خلت العالم من برا هو ينتبه ويعرف إنه حالياً المرحلة اللي بيمر بها في السودان هي شكلها شنو والحاجات الحاصلة. فبنلقى إنه الهاشتاجات بتساعد، سواء كانت في السوشيال ميديا عموماً، بتساعد في إنها تسلط الضوء على الثورات وعلى الحركات، على المبادرات بصورة عامة. فبتبقى الفكرة طالما في إيمان بالقضية وإيمان بالحاجة اللي إحنا بنعمل فيها، ده اللي بيضمن لنا استمرارية الحركة. قالت إنها ممكن تموت يعني الغضب ما كافي، وهاشتاج فقط ما كافي. الإيمان هو الكافي يديها استمرارية عشان يقدروا يحققوا مبتغاهم ومطالبهم اللي هم طلعوا عشانها. يعني إحنا بداية لما قلنا تسقط بس إيماننا بأنه لابد تتم حتمية السقوط للنظام السابق. بقت الفكرة النظام حيسقط بعد كم من الزمن إحنا ما عارفين. بس إيماننا بالقضية، إيماننا بحرية وطننا هو اللي خلانا نستمر في الاحتجاجات بمختلف الأساليب، سواء كانت مواكب ليلية، تجمعات ومواكب مدن وأحياء، سواء كانت إضراب وعصيان مدني، إغلاق للشوارع في بعض الأحيان. دي كلها أساليب استخدمناها عشان ما نصل لإننا نحقق المبتغى اللي إحنا طلعنا عشانه، وهو كان بداية إسقاط النظام. فبقت الفكرة اللي بيساعد الحركات والثورات إنها تستمر إيماننا وإيماننا التام ودعمنا التام لها، بحيث إنه لابد نحقق أهدافنا. إذا ما حققنا أهدافنا ما حنقدر نتوقف عن الطلوع للشارع أو كده. فاستمرت 4 شهور لحد ما تم الإسقاط. حقيقة كان ممكن تستمر أكثر من كده، يعني إحنا ما كنا عارفين لما أول يوم طلعنا ما كنا عارفين النظام حيسقط بعد أسبوع، بعد شهر، بعد شهرين، بعد سنة، ما كنا عارفين. بس المؤمنين به تماما إنه دي نهاية الظلم في السودان، دي نهاية الفساد، و... وإنه لابد من إنه نشوف وطننا الحر أو الوطن اللي إحنا بنحلم به. فإذا الإيمان هو اللي أدانا الدافع بالاستمرارية في إننا نحقق مبتغانا، ولحد اليوم إحنا مستمرين، لأنه كمان قلنا حرية، سلام وعدالة. إحنا ما حنقدر نقيف إذا ما يتحققت كامل شعارات ثورتنا، ونقدر نشوف الحرية والسلام والعدالة على أرض الواقع، نعيش كل الحاجات دي في السودان. حتى بعد إحنا حنقدر نقول إحنا حققنا الحاجة اللي إحنا طلعنا عشانها، وحققنا الوعد اللي كان بيننا وبين شهداء الثورة.
Alicia, it is fantastic to have you join this conversation on development and its futures. In our work at UNDP and with the main theme of this year's IID, we're learning from those who are decommissioning worldviews that are no longer useful in understanding our realities, as to be able to see and unleash different power dynamics across the world, those that recognize legitimacy in different development paths that may not come out of Bretton Woods institution playbook. In your book, you also speak about things that you learned, but more importantly, things that you had to unlearn in your work on social justice. What have some of those unlearnings been for you?
You know, this is such a great question, and I rarely get asked this. So thank you for bringing the most important thing to the forefront. I would answer this in 2 ways. The first thing, idea, concept, practice that I think we need to unlearn, or at least get sharper at, is understanding the difference between power and empowerment. And particularly in this context, right? So often when we are trying to address inequality, when we are trying to disrupt inequality, we often do so from what I call a charity framework, right? Where those who are more fortunate give back, give back to, air quotes, to those who are less fortunate. And frankly, that does not interrupt at all the dynamics of oppression. It makes people feel better, right? But it does not actually interrupt the dynamics or the root cause of why it is that some people have more and some people have less. And I think stemming from that, then, we believe that empowerment, right? Empowerment of communities, empowerment of individuals is the way to interrupt dynamics that are actually less about whether or not people are disempowered or have a lack of self-esteem, and have everything to do with power itself. For me, I describe power as the ability to make the rules and the ability to change the rules. And there are many different forms of power that operate in our world at any given time. And when we look at social movements, there are a range of forms of power that we must build in order to interrupt the dynamics that bring so much misery and devastation to our communities. Power is fundamentally about who gets what, when, and why. Power is about how we distribute resources, where we put money and where we don't, where we put resources and where we don't, and why. It is about shaping the story of who we are and who we can be together and who we're not. It is also about there being consequences when the people who represent us fail to do so. That is power. It is about rules, rigged rules that keep some people left out and left behind, and other people and communities, institutions moved forward, right, at their expense. And so when you juxtapose these two things, power and empowerment, you can see that there is quite a difference between changing the rules and making new ones and making people individually feel better about themselves. The other idea that I would really encourage us to rethink and reimagine is better understanding what racism is and what it's not. Racism is one of the most misunderstood, maybe willfully, ways of being organized in our society. And racism is actually a classification system, and certainly it is something that is socially constructed, meaning that it was developed and designed by people, and therefore it can be undone by people. But one of the ways that racism is able to proliferate and sustain itself across the world is that too many of us believe that racism fundamentally is about people being mean to each other. We think it's about interpersonal personality conflicts. And therefore, if that's how we understand the why, then our solutions that we design will be much more about making sure that people are nicer to each other, that there is compassion and empathy. All of those things are good and they're important values, but they do not interrupt racism, because like power, racism is about rigged rules. In fact, the system of racism is about designing rules and then the accompanying cultural ideas that justify why some people have and why some people don't. And we use the criteria of skin color to be able to determine who deserves life and who does not. And so being nicer to each other does nothing to interrupt that, because we are still operating under those frameworks. So power versus empowerment, racism as a series of rigged rules that protect power versus interpersonal personality conflicts or, people being benevolent or malevolent to each other are some of the fundamental ideas that I think will be able to shape the next decade and the next 2 decades. And it's something that we have to be very rigorous in addressing so that we can get to the root cause of the challenges that we face.
It is interesting to hear from both of you how changing power relations requires pressing on various levers, from hashtags to generating international spotlight to on-the-ground coordination and activism that reveals local heroes, builds and maintains the momentum, and continually articulates what power shifts you seek to bring about. But we know that every action provokes a reaction. So, Alaa, I'd like to know, in your opinion, what is a statement we heard during the 2019 revolution that says, break the girls, because if you break the girls, you will break the men? What does that mean? And in 2 years since the revolution, can you point to societal shifts in perception and attitudes about the role of women in Sudan?
يمكن تصريح قوي: حطموا الفتيات لأنكم إذا حطمتوهم فأنتم حتحطموا الرجال. إحنا كنا في السودان كنا بنقول صوت المرأة ثورة والثورة مرأة. فإذا بقت الفكرة إنه المرأة هي أساس النضال، هي أساس الثورة. يمكن 65% من المتظاهرين في ثورتنا كانوا هم نساء. فدي حاجة بتورينا إنه مدى القوة اللي عندنا كنساء في السودان. بداية الإعلان الموقف بيكون بزغروطة من البنات. الزغروطة بتحمس أكثر وبتعلن عن بداية انطلاقة الموقف. فبنرجع لإنه انطلاقة الموقف من زغروطة من بيت من مرأة. شوفي يعني دي حاجة بتدينا قوة أكثر. كمان بنقول يعني إذا عايزين نتكلم عن المجتمعات ممكن بتقول إنه مكان المرأة بيتها ومكان المرأة في المطبخ، ويعني دي يعني يمكن حاجات هي مرفوضة بالنسبة لي. بس برد بنقول إنه شنو؟ فإنه الثورة طلعت من المطبخ اللي هو بيحتوي المرأة، قدر إنه يصنع الثورة بكمية النساء اللي إحنا كنا بنشوفهم، وأنا واحدة منهم كنت في الشارع، فبلقى إنه المرأة ما مكان المطبخ، أو المطبخ في حد ذاته ما كضعف للمرأة، بالعكس قوة بالنسبة لنا. وإذا الثورة بدت من وين وطلعت من وين؟ في المواكب واحنا بنكون طالعين، يعني في نساء اكبر مننا عمرا يمكن ما بيكونوا قادرين انهم يتحركوا، لانه المواكب بتمشي مسافات طويله جدا، وفي بعض الاحيان بتكون معرضه للاعتقالات والضرب. فمعانا النساء يمكن ما يقدروا انهم يتحملوا كل الحاجات دي نظرا لكبر عمرهم، بس بنلقى انهم بصورة أو بأخرى كانوا معانا في المواكب، خصوصا في فترة اللي اتنقلت فيها المواكب من المواكب المركزية لمواكب المدن والأحياء. فبنلقى إنه أماتنا أو النساء يعني باعتبار إنهم أمات، يعني أمات بالنسبة لنا، بيكونوا واقفين في الشوارع مجهزين مثلا موية، أو بيقدموا لنا الحاجة المتوفرة في مطبخهم عشان ما يدعمونا ونقدر نواصل في طريقنا للموكب، وفي طريقنا يعني في الحاجة اللي احنا بنعمل فيها. فكل واحدة بتحاول تكون معانا باللي هي بتقدر فيه، فبنلقى انه المطبخ بتاعه هو يعني الحاجة اللي قدمتها لنا من المطبخ هي اللي خلتها تشارك معانا في الثورة، رغم انهم كبر عمرها او عدم قدرتها لانها تتحرك معانا مسافات طويلة. بس برجع وبقول إنه إحنا في الثورة أدوارنا كانت تكاملية بمختلف أعمارنا، بمختلف ثقافاتنا، فالما قادر إنه يمشي فكان بصوته، الما كان يعني كان بصوته، بعطائه، بقدرة، يعني بالمقدرة بتاعته الجسمانية على إنه يتحرك، أو الشباب في إنهم كيف يقدروا يرجعوا عبوات البومبان للقوات النظامية، كيف يقدروا يتصدوا لجان التأمين، اللجان الطبية، لجان التخطيط. فكلها كانت أدوار بالنسبة لنا تكاملية قدرنا من خلالها نقدر نصنع الثورة العظيمة دي. فبنلقى إنه حتى النساء اللي هم ربات البيوت كانوا معانا، وكانوا جزء من الثورة دي. فبنرجع وبنقول إنه صوت المرأة ثورة. وإذا أنت قضيت يعني دم بمعنى كلامه، إذا أنت حطمت النساء فأنت حتحطم الرجال، لأنه النساء هم كانوا الدينامو الرئيسي المحرك للثورة حقيقة. يعني دي حاجة بنشهد بها كلنا. فبنلقى إنه إذا حطمت النساء فبالتالي الكفة حتتغير، والمشهد كله بصورة عامة حيتغير تماما. فإذا بنرجع لأنه النساء هن الأساس، وأينما وجدت المرأة وجد السلام.
Thanks, Alaa, for that answer. And I'd like to circle back to this question of intergenerational divide in a bit. But for now, Alicia, this past year, indirectly, the US social justice movement seems to have triggered a whole rethinking across the globe of social justice and the role of various minorities in countries around the world. How do you react to this? And have you had conversations with citizen group from other countries who may have wanted to compare notes and learn from your experience with Black Futures Lab?
Sure. Interestingly, social movements across the world have been influenced and impacted by each other. And I'm often reticent, right, when social movements in the United States are kind of placed in the center of the conversation, because that is a geopolitical dynamic that we know is harmful for a lot of us. But with that being said, I do agree with you that the social movements in the United States, particularly over the last 10 years, have really stepped up in a way that is important, and that shows that on the one hand, that the devastation of our communities is getting stronger, even inside of, one of the most, if not the most powerful empire in the world. And there is more of a desire, right, to connect with social movements across the world for the purposes of being more powerful together. The things that are happening here in the United States are often exported to other countries. And so I would say, I grew up not just learning about, social movements here domestically, but also being inspired by and influenced by social movements globally. And I've had the opportunity to meet with Quilombola communities, right? I've had the opportunity to learn from Afro-Colombian communities that are fighting gentrification and displacement. I've had the opportunity to learn from Black and Indigenous communities in Australia, right? And learn about the connections and relationships between our struggles. And my hope is that over the next decade, that what will shape it is stronger relationships and increased coordination amongst our movements for the purposes of building more power and transforming power as it operates today. I would be remiss if I didn't say that, for at least the last decade, there has been a trend globally, right, of more rightward facing governments led by social movements, right? I mean, I always think it's important to remind us that social movements are not just reserved for those of us who want to see a more just and more fair world. Social movements are also kind of rooted in those of us who want to see a consolidation of power, want to see less and less people being able to make decisions over their own lives and the futures of their communities. And those movements are constantly in a clash of interests with each other. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that the social movements that are pushing us more in a rightward direction have been winning. And they have been winning big over the last couple of decades. And so my hope in the social movements that are geared towards justice, having more connection and relationship that is not just during crisis, but is ongoing, is that I think it will take a networking of our social movements to be able to change not just what's happening here in the United States, but what it seems to be a trend happening globally as well.
Alaa, going back to the point you made earlier, it is fascinating to see how the civic movement has had an indirect effect on bridging intergenerational divides and pulling on very different groups in the society to affect change. So is it fair to say that the generational gap is coming to a head when questioning dominant narratives about women and role of women in Sudan?
يمكن في بداية التظاهرات لما إحنا كنا بنطلع فكنا بنسمع عبارات من الناس الأكبر سنا مننا إنه مثلا ديل شوف حسابي، معناه إنه ديل ناس صغار في العمر، صغار في التجربة، هم مثلا ما قادرين إنه يعني مثلا هم كانوا بيشوفوا إنه اللي بيعملوا فيه وهم كناس أكبر مننا هو اللي كان صح، وإحنا كان يعني شوف ما عارفين إحنا عايزين نعمل شنو، بس عندنا طاقة كده، بس عايزين نطلع الشارع. هم كانوا شايفين كده في الوقت اللي إنه إحنا بالنسبة لنا مش بس يعني إحنا عندنا حقوق عايزينها، عندنا وطن عايزين حريته، عندنا مشاكل مع نظام غمعي قدر إنه في 30 سنة اللي فاتت يعني يدمر السودان تماماً. فدي حاجات بالنسبة لنا إحنا كشباب ما كانت مرضية. فأول أيام كنا بنسمع كلمات يعني هي ممكن باللغة الدارجية يعني إنه ديل شوف ديل ما عندهم موضوع، ديل بس حيطلعوا كده يومين ثلاثة وحيوقفوا، ما قادرين يفهموا إنه إحنا مؤمنين بالحاجة اللي إحنا بنعمل فيها، وضرورة والتغيير بقى بالنسبة لنا مسألة حتمية، مسألة زمن ما أكتر من كده، يعني حاجة دي إحنا مؤمنين بها وإحنا بنعمل فيها. فكان صراحة في فجوة بين إنه هم شايفين إنه إحنا بنضيع في زمننا، إنه إحنا ما مفروض نطلع، المفروض نكون قاعدين، وإحنا كمان كان عندنا تحفظات على إنه بنقول يعني هم أكبر مننا عمراً، أي نعم، ونحترم الحاجة دي جداً، بس يمكن لو هم كانوا في عمرنا كانوا رفضوا الوضع اللي كان حاصل، يمكن ما إحنا كنا وصلنا بالسودان لليوم يعني لليوم اللي خلانا نطلع بالسوء اللي كان حاصل في الأوضاع في السودان. فكان في عدم تفهم واستهتار بقضيتنا وبمطالبنا. بس إيماننا هو اللي خلانا نثبت لهم إنه إحنا عارفين إحنا بنعمل في شنو، وإحنا عارفين إحنا عايزين نعمل شنو، وإحنا عارفين عايزين السودان نعيش فيها. السودان إحنا بنحلم إننا نعيش فيه وبنتمنى إننا نعيش فيهم. يمكن مع المواكب ومع استمرارها من شهر شهرين ثلاثة وهي ماشية شوية شوية الفكرة بدأت تتغير، وبدوا الناس اللي أكبر مننا يستوعبوا إحنا بنعمل في شنو، إنها ما بس كانت يومين ثلاثة الناس بس متحمسة وأنا حتطلع الشارع عشان يعني تقول تضبط بس في المواكب كده. لا، الحاجة أكبر من إنه يومين ثلاثة. فالناس الأكبر مننا بدوا يفهموا الطاقة الجوانا، الغضب الجوانا على كل الممارسات اللي إحنا ما كنا راضينها في السودان. بدأ التغيير بعدها لحد ما جاء في شهر أبريل بعد اعتصام القيادة العامة، بقينا بنشوف الناس الأكبر مننا بمختلف أعمارهم يعني بيكونوا في القيادة، في اعتصام القيادة العامة. يعني بنجي داخلين بيكون في الآباء، الأمات، الأجداد. يعني كمان اعتصام القيادة العامة غير إنه جمعنا، يعني جمع السودانيين بمختلف أماكننا اللي إحنا عايشين منها وثقافاتنا الجايين مننا، جمع السودانيين بمختلف أعمارهم، بمختلف أفكارهم، بمختلف ثقافاتهم. فكان تجمع. يمكن يعني أنا إذا كنت بفكر إنه أنا أزور السودان، فبلقى إن أنا في خلال فترة اعتصام القيادة العامة أنا زرت كل السودان من خلال كل منطقة بيكون عندها خيمة معينة في مكان معين قاعد في القيادة. ومن خلال زيارتي لهم بحس إنه أنا زرت المكان من خلال قصصهم، من خلال الكلام اللي هو بيحكوا لي عن جمال المنطقة اللي هم جايين منها، عن إني أشوف ثقافتهم، أشوف لبسهم، أسمع لهجتهم، طريقة كلامهم، أذوق أكلهم. فدي كلها حاجات خلتني أزور كل السودان في فترة الشهرين ديل. وكمان خلت إنه يعني كل الناس تكون، يعني حتى الناس اللي كانوا في البداية بيقولوا علينا طالعين ساي، آمنوا بالحاجة اللي إحنا بنعمل فيها وشفناهم معانا فيما بعد في القيادة. فبعتقد إنه الثورة هي قدرت توصل لهم إنه الطاقة الشبابية طاقة جبارة جدا، وآمالنا وتطلعاتنا وأحلامنا أكبر من إنه إحنا كشباب نعيش أسيرين لنظام مستبد، نظام جائر، نظام بيسرق عمرنا مننا. يعني فيما بعد آمنوا، يعني الناس الأكبر مننا، الأجيال اللي سبقونا، فهموا تماما هم بيتعاملوا مع جيل شكله شنو، القوة الجواه شنو، أحلام والطاقة الجوانا، وكل الحاجات دي هي قدرت توصل لهم إنه إحنا لما طلعنا وقلنا تسقط بس، ولما طلعنا الشارع عشان كان عندنا رؤية معينة وتصور معين للسودان وإحنا بنحقق فيها اليوم. فدي حاجة كانت يعني من الحاجات اللي بنقدر نقول من انتصاراتنا في الثورة، إنه نظرة المجتمع بالنسبة لنا اتغيرت، نظرة المجتمع مش بس بالنسبة لنا كشباب، نظرة المجتمع للمرأة اتغيرت، نظرة المجتمع للشباب للبنات اتغيرت تماما. يعني بقى في وعي ما طبيعي باختلافنا وباحترام بعض وباحترام ثقافاتنا. وكمان يعني احنا حتى كشباب يمكن في من الحاجات اللي حاول النظام السابق انه يزرعها فينا العنصرية الجهوية القبلية، انه يعني اي زول يحتز بيقول انا من المكان الفلاني. هي فعلا حاجه كويسه انك من المكان الفلاني، بس في النهايه احنا كلنا سودانيين. انا لما اتسائل انت من وين، بقول انا من السودان، انا سوداني. يعني انا ما بحب اقول انه انا من الجهه الفلانيه، انا من المكان الفلاني، لا، بقول انا سودانيه، لانه احنا كلنا سودانيين. يمكن دي الحاجه اللي كانت بتجمعنا، حبنا للسودان، وهو اللي خلانا نتوحد، هو اللي خلى التناغم بيننا، هو اللي خلانا نقدر نحقق الحاجات يعني يمكن في فترة القيادة نكون عايشين مع بعض، عايشين مع بعض، بناكل وبنشرب مع بعض، بنبيت يعني نايمين مع بعض في القيادة. يعني يعني حياتنا وبيوتنا بقت في القيادة. فيمكن من الحاجات اللي أنا يعني فخورة جدا إنه أنا كنت جزء من الشباب اطلعوا في ثورة ديسمبر، إنه أنا قدرت أعيش التجربة دي، قدرت ألاقي السودانيين من مختلف أماكن السودان بمختلف ثقافاتهم وأفكارهم، وبكون مستمتعة جدا وأنا بسمع في قصصهم وبسمع في وصفهم لمناطق السودان المختلفة. فيمكن دي حاجة حافظة فخورة جدا، فخورة طول عمري إنه أنا كنت جزء من من آلاف الشباب، كنت واحدة من آلاف الشباب اللي كانوا في ثورة ديسمبر، وقدرنا نخلق التغيير بتاع الأفكار، قدرنا نغير أفكار ونظرات نظرة الناس الأكبر مننا لينا بإنه إحنا منو، إحنا بنعمل في شنو. فدي حاجة كنت وحاضر بفتخر بيها جدا.
Alicia, you talk a lot about how in spite of the language and symbolism in support of valuing Black lives in the US, it has been very difficult to get the substantive policy changes that can close the gap in disparities between that Black communities face in the US. Did this drive the Black Census project you started in 2019 that covered over 35,000 Black individuals? And if a little bit of a research that we've done is correct, this was one of, if not the largest effort of this kind in 150 years in the US, as an effort to build the basis for some of those policy changes that you speak about. And what are some of the insights from that effort that surprised you?
The Black Census is one of my favorite projects. And really, the reason that I love it so much is because it is inspired from many different origins, but one origin is the W.E.B. Du Bois book, Black Reconstruction. And in it, he painstakingly describes a period in the history of, the United States where chattel slavery had been formally abolished. The nation was split apart between the Confederacy and the Union. And in the middle of all of that, right, were newly enfranchised Black residents who did not yet have citizenship in this country. As you know, in our Constitution, Black people were deemed 3/5 of a human being, mainly, for the purposes of apportioning power and property. And so in that period, there was a moment when the country was torn apart and people had to figure out whether or not the project of the nation would continue. And if so, how would Black people be integrated as citizens? And to embark upon that process of learning and reshaping and reimagining, the United States government led a massive survey of newly emancipated people who they needed to understand, right? What are the education needs? What are the housing needs? What are the healthcare needs? And it resulted in a government program called the Freedmen's Bureau. And that was a program that then, distributed resources to newly emancipated Black communities with a short-lived, but an attempt nonetheless, to enfranchise Black people in this country as full citizens. For me, this project, the Black Census, is really in the spirit of that kind of project, where we are trying to learn more about who Black people are in this country, what it is that we experience every day, and what we want to see done about the challenges in our communities. And I started this project because I feel very strongly that as a nation, in some cases, because of the strength and the power of this movement, there is a reckoning that is happening around race, around racism, around exclusion, and around power differentials. And Black communities deserve to be a central piece of that conversation. But too often, our communities are treated as symbols rather than being invested in with substance. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples. And for me, part of it has to do with the fact that we don't tell nuanced stories about who Black people are in this nation. We have taken to shorthand in talking about Black communities and saying African Americans, which are Black people who are born here in the United States. But we also know that, due to globalization and a ton of other kind of economic and political pressures, Black immigration to the United States has increased more than 10% over the last decade. And that means that the population of Black migrants here in this country has exploded. And Black folks who live in this country are not necessarily all the same. And so we really wanted to embark on a project that allowed for us to be able to see the nuances and the layers of our communities and the layers of our experiences based on where we come from, based on where we live, and based on what we have access to and what we don't. In this project, which is, you're right, the largest survey, we believe, of Black people in America since Reconstruction, which was the period I was describing earlier, the most common thing that we heard from people that we talked to in all 50 states, from every demographic that you can think of, was that nobody had ever asked what we think, what we want, and what we experience every day, which, as you know, does not bode well for a healthy or robust democracy. But we didn't stop at the process of collecting data. We used that data in the service of designing new rules for our communities that would redistribute resources in a way that could help address some of the biggest problems facing us, not just Black people, but in this country as a whole. We found that low wages that were not enough to support a family was the #1 issue that was keeping Black communities up at night. But we also found that Black communities had very clear ideas about how to solve for these problems. And it is because, in so many ways, when you are systemically kept from the resources you need to survive, the human in us, right, strives to keep breathing. And so we have to be creative and innovative in the face of such adversity. And I think the other thing that is important about the Black Census is that it can be used to expose how systemic racism operates. It is clear that amongst such a diverse grouping of people, the fact that most people are saying the same thing about their experience, whether they live in the South or the North, whether they are a migrant or born in this country, that there are common experiences of being left out and left behind. You know, we have a new administration in this country, and we just used some of this data to build what we called a Build Back Bolder agenda, which is a Black mandate for the Biden-Harris administration. It is incredibly important that we have the first Black and Indian woman to ever serve as vice president of this nation. Definitely important that the president of this country served as the vice president for the first Black president in the history of our nation. And it's also not enough to just have that level of representation. We need policies, we need new rules, and we need money to be able to implement those new rules and ensure that people have the things they need to live well.
What both of you said, Alicia, you about bringing nuanced stories about assets and needs of Black communities in the US, and Alaa, you about various societal groups coming together in Sudan to effect change, makes me think of a quote I had read recently about the India's farmer protest that says, this movement is basically a school of democracy. You learn that this is the people in all of their variety, and you need to figure out how to work with them. So Alaa, I'm curious to know, what other factors can you point to that open up new possibilities for women to sustain their fight for social justice in an otherwise extremely constrained context for women? What needs to happen to make a whole of society to change its understanding of the role of women?
يمكن الثورة هي اللي خلت المجتمع ينظر بصورة مختلفة للمرأة ولدورها. يعني زمان ممكن زي ما كنت بقول من قبل شوية إنه كانوا بيقول لك إنه المرأة مكانها بيتها، المرأة مكانها مطبخها. فبعد الثورة وبعد الدور اللي قدموه النساء، الدور العظيم جدا، فأجبر المجتمع يغير وجهة نظره عن النساء وعن وين هم ممكن يكونوا. فبقت الفكرة إنه أنا كمرأة ما محتاجة زول يجي يقول لي المرأة مكان المطبخ، مكانها وين، مكانها كده. أنا كمرأة عارفة أنا مكاني وين، عارفة أنا مفروض أعمل شنو، مؤمنة بالحاجة اللي أنا بعمل فيها، فبالتالي أنا أحدد أنا عايزة أعمل شنو بالضبط. فالمجتمع بصورة أو بأخرى أفكاره اتغيرت تماماً من إنه كيف كان بينظر للمرأة، كيف شايف إنه المرأة ممكن تعمل شنو. فكان يعني ممكن كان بينظروا لها بنوع من إنه هي ما قادرة تعمل حاجة، في الوقت اللي إنه نحن قادرات نعمل أي شيء. فبتبقى الفكرة في إنه طالما أنا قادرة أعمل حاجة، طالما أنا قادرة أقدم، أكيد ما هأرضى لنظرات مجتمع إنه هو شايفني أنا شنو، فأنا هعمل على إنه أعمل الحاجة اللي أنا بحبها، الحاجة اللي أنا شايفة نفسي قادرة أقدمها، الحاجة اللي أنا واثقة منها. فبالتالي بصورة أو بأخرى المجتمع نظرة حتتغير، وده اللي حصل بعد ثورة ديسمبر تماما. الوضع اتغير ونظرة الناس لينا في الشارع اتغيرت بعد الثورة. بنلقى إنه يعني نحن كنا جزء أساسي، جزء يعني المواكب يمكن زي ما قلت برضه إنه 65% هم كانوا نساء. فبالتالي يعني ده مثال حي لإنه شوفوا نحن قادرين نعمل شنو، شوفوا إحنا في إمكانياتنا إنه نعمل شنو. وأنا مؤمنة تماما بإنه المرأة قادرة تعمل أي شيء إذا لقت الإمكانيات، رغم إنه ما كان في تقبل لبعض الأدوار، لكن بقى في إيمان بإنه إحنا قادرين نعمل حاجة، إنه قادرين نحدث تغيير. فبقينا مواصلين رغم إنه كمان سياسات النظام السابق كلها كانت موضوع عشان تحيد من حرية المرأة وتحيد من حرية من حركة المرأة وتحيد من تجمعاتنا ومن مناداتنا ومن صوتنا. بس ثرنا على النظام، كسرنا ال 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 الأقمعة اللي إحنا كنا موضوعين فيها، اللي كنا بالغصب لازم نكون قاعدين في الزون المربع ده في الوقت، لأنه يمكن إحنا في السودان كسودان يعني دولة فيها تنوع كبير جدا، وتنوعنا أنا بشوف إنه التنوع ده هو الحاجة اللي بتميزنا. فبنلقى إنه ما ممكن إن كمية الاختلاف في الثقافات وفي العقليات إننا نكون موضوعين تحت نمط معين، يعني على حسب اعتقاد النظام السابق إنه كلنا لازم نكون بالشكل ده، في الوقت لأنه إحنا في تباين كبير جدا في أشكالنا وفي ثقافاتنا. فإحنا في الثورة ثرنا على القوانين اللي هي كانت بتقيدنا وكانت بتكبلنا، كسرنا القيود يعني خدتنا نفسنا في المكان اللي بيشبهنا، اللي إحنا شايفين نفسنا المفروض نكون فيه. فبقت الفكرة إنه التغيير اللي حصل كانوا النساء جزء كبير منه، رغم إنه هم كانوا يمكن أكثر فئة في المجتمع كانت يعني زي ما قلت بسبب سياسات النظام السابق كانت مكبلة ومقيدة، بس كل الحاجات دي ما منعتنا من إنه نطالب بحقوقنا. وكمان الوطأ الأكبر إنه في فترة المظاهرات إذا تم اعتقال البنات، وكان بيتم اعتقال للبنات طبعا يعني دي حاجة كانت واضحة. في بعض الأحيان يعني الممارسات اللي كانت بتتم في في الزنازين يعني بتاعت النظام السابق، إنه بيحلقوا للبنات شعرهم، ممكن يعني بالآليات الحادة ممكن يجرحوهم. في بعض الأحيان وصل حد للأسف الاغتصاب في الزنازين، مش بس اغتصاب للنساء، يعني كان حتى للرجال. يعني دي كلها ممارسات كانت بتتم من النظام السابق علينا، بس أبدا الحاجة دي ما رضختنا وما خوفتنا وما خلت العزيمة جوانا تقل. بتذكر في يوم من الأيام بداية يعني لما كنت بطلع المواكب كنت بطلع من غير علم أمي، نظرا لأنها كانت يعني خوفة وقلقة، فكنت بطلع من غير ما يكونوا الناس البيت عارفين. فلما عرفت إنه أنا قاعدة أطلع المواكب ومشاركة في الثورة وكده، فبدت تتكلم معي، قالت لي إنه أنا ما خايفة عليك من الموت، لأنه الموت هو مصير الأولين والآخرين، بس أنا خايفة عليك من الحاجات اللي ممكن تحصل وإنها تكون يعني مصاحباك طول عمرك، بمعنى اللي هو الممارسات اللي بتتم في المعتقلات السياسية إذا تم اعتقالي. فكانت أختي في نفس الوقت قاعدة قالت لي إذا حصل ولا قدر الله إنه تم، وأفضل حاجة ممكن تحصل لنا إحنا كبنات الاغتصاب مثلا، إذا حصل وحصلت لك الحاجة دي كوني فخورة بنفسك، كوني فخورة لأنك أنت طلعتي عندك قضية وعندك وطن عايزة بتطالبي بحريته، عندك مبادئ، عندك قيم أنت متمسكة بها. فإذا حصلت وتمت الحاجة دي فما تضعفك وما تكسرك وما تخليكي تشوفي نفسك أقل أو أضعف، لا تزيدك قوة، تزيدك إصرار، تزيدك عزيمة، لأنه أنت عندك قضية طلعتي عشانها. فبعدها كلامهم بالنسبة لي كان أداني ثقة كبيرة جدا إنه يعني إلى أي مدى إحنا وصلنا من الوعي؟ يعني إذا تمت الحاجة دي مقابلة أنت طلعت عشان شنو؟ أنت هدفك كان شنو؟ وأنت طلعت عشان بتعمل في شنو؟ فمن بعد اليوم داك أنا بقيت ما بخاف على نفسي وأنا طالعة، يعني من بعد الثقة اللي كانت يعني ادوني لها امي واختي في انه اذا حصل فخليكي واثقه، خليكي فخوره بنفسك، والحاجه دي هي كانت بتحصل يعني. ولحد فض اعتصام القياده العامه كان في اغتصاب للبنات للاسف حصل، و فالفكره بدات تتغير انه خليكي يعني مؤمنه بالحاجه اللي انت عملتيها، وخليكي فخوره بها، انت قدمتي حاجه، يعني دي تضحيه قدمتيها انت. التضحيه كانت بطرق مختلفه، في ناس قدمت ارواحها، في ناس فقدت اجزاء من جسمها، في ناس يعني حصلت لهم الحاجات دي في المعتقلات. خليكي فخوره. فده برجعنا لانه رغم انه احنا كان ممكن نصل للمرحله دي، لكن لا، كنا مواصلين في طريق الحريه اللي احنا راسمينه، واحنا شايفين نهايته انه ممكن يحصل فيها شنو بالنسبه لنا، حنوصل لانه نعيش في السودان اللي احنا بنحلم به. فده كان طريقنا، ودي كانت كلها يعني بالنسبه لنا يمكن ضرائب لثمن الحريه. الحريه ثمنها غالي جدا، وقدمنا ارواح ودماء طاهره وغاليه جدا علينا في سبيل انه نصل لها. فبقت انه لا، يعني حنقدم لحد ما نصل للحاجه اللي احنا بنحلم بها يعني.
Alicia, a little bit earlier, you pointed out how important it is for communities to tell their own stories and have agency to influence their own lives. You point out that many people talk about movements without talking to the people who are doing the work and pushing the movement forward. This echoes what many in the development sector see as a failing of the sector to not engage with sufficiently enough and devolve power to local groups. What do you have to say for organizations like UNDP, whose mandate is to build the agency of local groups to tell their own stories, but that still operate in a sector largely dominated by Western legacy?
Yes, a Western legacy. That was a nice way of saying it. Well, look.
We got to get to the heart of it, because if we're not asking questions, I don't think we're doing what we're supposed to do.
I agree with you 100%. And I'll even take it farther and say, you know, in so many ways, we have institutions that were kind of designed under colonial frameworks, and they are trying to emerge and reinvent themselves. And I think one of the ways that we can start to do that is by investigating how we privilege certain types of knowledge over others. You know, I just talked about how Black communities have been forced to innovate and to experiment because we cannot make do without clean water. We cannot make do without a roof over our heads. We cannot make do without food. So we've had to figure out innovative ways, right, to access the things that we need, even when they are being kept from us intentionally. And that is the kind of knowledge, I think, that doesn't get prioritized and it doesn't get legitimized. And a lot of that has to do with, as you said, you know, Western frameworks and Western legacies. And I want to be clear, though, that I think it also has a lot to do with the legacy of colonialism, where there is, you know, knowledge that is valued, right? And it's usually knowledge of white people and white communities, right? And then there is knowledge that, you know, again, symbolically, right? We all like to talk about, you know, indigenous sensibilities, right? Indigenous frameworks, indigenous worldviews. We'll even do land acknowledgements, right? But are we repatriating land back to indigenous people? No. And so these are the very real contradictions. You know, I always find it interesting because our communities that have been left out and left behind know the most about what it means to reshape economies so that people don't get left behind. They know the most about what it means to reshape democracies so that everybody has a say in how it is that we move forward. And they may not have degrees from fancy universities, right? But they have a degree from the fancy university of surviving colonialism and imperialism, and that should be good enough. So I just want to like make that super plain. And the other thing I think that really happens here is we have to give up control. I mean, that is a part of transforming power and the way that it operates. It's not enough just to put people who have been left out and left behind inside of the same systems that were designed to leave people out and behind, right? That just means you have a person of color at the helm of a system that is going to keep working exactly as it was designed to work. We do really need to investigate and interrogate, what it means to share power and what it means to give up power. And I'm not somebody who likes to kind of operate in this framework of makers and takers, right? Because that's not our framework. But I do think that in order for transformation to happen, there has to be a change of the existing social order and the existing economic order. And that is going to be uncomfortable. It is going to mean that those who were privileged before, right, are going to get equalized with everybody else. And people may experience that as a loss of power, but I would say that it's more of an equalization of power. And we do have to have some kind of process by which we are reckoning with that.
Alicia, you founded the Black Futures Lab in large part to fulfill that mission of building agency locally for people to tell their own stories and to transform Black communities into constituencies that can change the way power operates locally, statewide, and nationally. Why a lab? And what are you particularly interested in learning about dynamics of power?
Yeah, well, we call it a lab because we do a lot of experiments. We have created this organization to be able to innovate on the ways in which we engage people civically and innovate on models of building power. And with that innovation and experimentation, we are acknowledging right off the front that we don't know everything, that we're going to try some things and some of the things we try aren't going to work. But in the process of failing fast, hopefully we get to the things that do work much more quickly. And we try to figure out not just how those things can be replicated. Some things cannot be because communities are unique in a bunch of ways. But we do try to figure out how we put our stake in the sand around transforming how power operates and making sure that Black people are a part of that process. For me as well, I really wanted to build the kind of institution that I believe Black communities deserve. If I believe that we deserve to be powerful in every aspect of our lives, how can this institution that I'm building not just recreate the wheel, but be an added value to what I think is a growing ecosystem of organizations that are trying to figure out this question of how to re-enfranchise Black people. And I have designed this organization in such a way where we get to be creative about how we approach these problems, but we also have some, what's the word I'm looking for? We have some pillars of engagement that I think are a challenge also to social movements. Number one, when people come on to our team at the lab, I always say, look, we are an organization that engages in elections. And if you don't believe that the electoral realm is a place for Black people to build power, this is probably not a place for you. This is not just a question about, Black Lives Matter or Black Futures Lab. This is really a question about social movements and how we plan to address and interrupt the way that power currently functions. And for many of us, there has always been this tension of whether or not to engage inside and whether or not to engage on this landscape. But if the last, 12 years have taught us anything, 12 years in the United States have taught us anything about how and why elections matter, it's that, when we don't engage, it's not that the system withers because of a lack of our engagement. It's that it gets stronger because people eat what we leave on the table. So, our organization is really focused on the political realm. And that also means that we make choices about what we do and what we don't do. We don't try to be everything to everyone, right? We are not an organization that organizes direct actions or protests, right? There are a ton of organizations that do that, and they do it really well. And we long for the opportunity to just join them, right? We don't need to take up all of that on our own. But when it comes to, grooming people who we would feel good about being in office, that's our job. When it comes to clearly articulating new rules and new solutions that can address generations old problems, that's our role. When it comes to pushing this administration to do better and be better by our communities unapologetically, that is our role. And when it comes to empowering our communities with the tools that we need to be able to reshape the rules, that is our job. And I'll give you a quick example. I have had this idea in my mind for a long time that we just were able to launch in the middle of the pandemic. We decided that we were going to design a public policy institute to help train Black people in communities how to write rules, how to win those rules, and how to implement them in cities and states, knowing that it's not enough for us to throw rocks at the castle, but we actually have to be the architects of a new society. And, we thought maybe we would get like 100 applications. We got 500 applications. We were able to train 39 Black fellows from 11 states across the nation. We invested almost $500,000 in Black communities across the country. And moving into this year, we'll be investing even more resources in helping to move policy campaigns that can win and change the rules in cities and states. And that is irrespective of what is happening with the federal government. So I think for us, we are taking up the reins in relationship to what it means to shape and change policy that is leaving people out and leaving people behind. But how do we do that from a perspective of being proactive about the world that we want to see? And that is not shade to the reactions, right, around the world that we don't want to see, but we need both. We need both in order to be a powerful force that can reshape this country and reshape the globe.
Alaa, it is humbling to hear your personal story about where you draw your strength. And it sounds like you speak on behalf of many other women in Sudan who have fought for decades for more rights for women. On this point, I'm curious to know what effect, if any, have Black Lives Matter protests last year had on the movement for social justice and women's rights in Sudan?
يمكن الأثر الحقيقي بيكون في إنه الناس في العالم قدرت تطالب بحقوقها وقدرت تكون عندها وعي أكثر بإنها عندها حق، والحق لابد إنه ينتزع مهما كان الضريبة اللي أنت ممكن تقدمها في سبيل إنك تاخذ حقك. فيمكن الانعكاس يمكن الحركة دي هي امتداد للحاجة اللي حصلت عندنا في السودان. فكرة أنا كنت بقول إنه كل شعب في العالم عنده قضية معينة، عنده ظروف معينة، فبنلقى إنه حياة السود مهمة في إنهم وعوا بإنهم لابد إنهم يطالبوا بحقوقهم. كان يعني بتختلف الأساليب من مكان لمكان، من ثقافة لثقافة، من شعب لشعب، بس بتبقى الفكرة إنه الحقوق بتنتزع انتزاع مهما كانت التضحيات اللي إنها هي ممكن تتقدم، ده بيبقى في النهاية أنت عندك حق وأنت لازم تحصل عليه. ويمكن دي الحاجة اللي كانت مشتركة في إنه هم كان يعني الحاجة المشتركة بين التظاهرات هنا والثورة في السودان وبين حركة السود مهمة، حياة السود مهمة عفوا، في إنه القمع اللي كان بيتم عليهم بصورة كبيرة جدا، اللي هو القمع برضو اللي كان بيتم علينا في فترة النظام السابق، كان يعني قمع وحشي، كان بيتعاملوا معنا بطريقة قمعية يعني وحشية جدا. فبنلقى إنهم هم كانوا بيطالبوا بحقوقهم. الوعي بتاع إنه أنت عندك حق ولابد إنك تتحصل عليه، ودي حاجة كانت يعني أثرها كبير جدا، ودي امتداد للوعي اللي حصل في العالم إنه الحقوق تنتزع انتزاع.
Alicia, Alaa's photo from the top of the car propelled her into a symbol of the revolution, but it was really her recitation and public performance that echoes a long tradition of Sudanese women to use alternative means of expression to fight for justice that really stood out. Tell us about the examples from your experience where alternative means of expressions, arts and culture, has turbocharged social movements and led to change.
Yeah. Wow, that's a big question. Let me say this. Black people have never been more represented in our mainstream media than we have been in the last 10 years. And I don't know if I'm going to say it's alternative forms of media, but I'm using this example because there are more stories where everybody watches, right, that are about the nuances of the Black experience than there ever have been before. You know, this summer was really the second iteration of Black Lives Matter, and it felt like a lot of people were being introduced to it for the first time, even though, you know, our entry point was certainly almost 10 years ago now. And I remember during this past summer, you know, protests happening everywhere, all over the globe, cities across America, including mine, with helicopters constantly droning. It felt like, you know, it felt like we were under, you know, some kind of occupation. It was very eerie in many places, including my own home. And I remember about 10 o'clock at night, like literally falling on my couch and just trying to take a breath. And I turned on the television, just like, you know, that feeling where you just are like, I just need to watch something stupid, senseless, with no plot, with no political message. And I turned on the television and I could not find anything of that nature. I went to go watch my reality shows, right? And they were having this deep conversation about race. And I was like, this is not what I want. I want the stupid storyline. I want the Real Housewives of Atlanta, right? But here are the Real Housewives talking about Black Lives Matter and systematic oppression, right? So I was like, I can't, that's never happened in my lifetime. Ever, where every single channel I went to, whether it be, you know, mainstream news, whether it be, you know, Hollywood, right? Everybody is talking about what it means to have this reckoning around race and racist violence. And that is what I would consider alternative media, to be 100% honest with you in this context. And then, of course, yes, there's a long pattern of creative expression. And one that I want to lift up that has moved me for a long time is being at a protest in Ferguson, Missouri, when Mike Brown was killed. And I spent a few weeks there working with a local organization to help train organizers in this moment of complete chaos. And at one of these protests, every protest, right, was met with police lines, arrests. Tear gas was becoming a regular occurrence. But in this particular protest, which was getting tense and there were arrests, you saw the police line up, riot police. And then out of the corner comes this mirrored coffin that was designed by an incredible artist out of Ferguson, Damon Davis, who does beautiful, beautiful work. And this mirrored coffin gets rolled up to this police line, and their reflections in this mirrored coffin was incredible. And it was incredible not just because of the performance of it, but it was incredible to see the very real impact that that piece had on the police themselves. They could not literally bear to look themselves in the mirror. And so those are some examples of some creative expression that I think change the way that people understand what's happening and they get underneath all of those stories that help keep us complacent with the way that things are. Well, police are there to keep us safe. Well, police have a hard job. Well, there's, just a few bad apples, but in general, police are good. That particular action was such a great example of how to get underneath those stories that help keep the status quo in place.
In Sudan, we heard slogans from women during the 2019 revolutions that went something like this: "You thank us in demonstrations and forget about us in negotiations. And I am a 100% protesting female, but I'm outside the power structures." There are echoes of this, Alicia, in your book, where you dig into this question of power. And the way you speak about it, sure, it regards the Black communities, but my guess is that many poor white and other minority communities, are also allies in this cause of gaining more political power, better wages, access to affordable healthcare and education. What has been your experience in connecting to, and as you point out, multiplying influence by reaching out to non-Black communities in order to translate energy from protests into political change?
Well, first of all, shout out to the Sudanese women who are making it so clear. And that's a statement that I think so many of us can relate to, that, we are valued figures in domination, right? But when it comes to changing the dynamics of domination, we're nowhere to be found. And that is not due to any fault of our own. It's due to the fact that, again, it's this dynamic between symbol and substance that really matters. I want to say that one of the ways in which social movements globally have impacted me personally is by helping me reframe what the world looks like. And it's interesting because, in the United States, people who are not white are now the majority. And we now reflect what the rest of the world looks like. And that's an important way for us to understand what our path to power is. What we're up against is capital, right? And corporate power over that capital. We have the power of people, numbers. There's more of us, right? And so what drives our strategy around how it is that we build power is really connecting communities from various aspects and perspectives who are being left out and left behind. And the challenge becomes, can we find common cause in each other's struggles? Not just, I think what you're doing is really cool over there, but what's happening to you is impacting me, and what's happening to me is impacting you. And that's why we are in relationship, and we are moving together on particular things as we also address the specific conditions that we're facing. So I start off that way because, when it comes to who we build with, right? We are looking for people who are looking for us. That's my motto. And then we have to figure out, right? How do we not throw each other under the bus in pursuit of crumbs? And this is the challenge, the number one challenge for the prospect of a movement of movements, is that what power does, the way it currently operates, is it tries to break up those kinds of alliances, those kinds of networks, that kind of collaboration. And it does it by, appealing to competition. And, if you could say to one group, well, I'm going to give you this, which is what folks have been doing here with white folks, right? Then you have a choice to make, right? And you can say, okay, I'm either going to continue on this path because that's not enough, or I'm going to say that's the best we're going to get and I'm going for it. So the experience that I have in building, with folks who are not Black or not of color is long. And I think some of the challenges to it are, in the United States, Black people are 13% of the population. So there is not a way right? Where Black folks are going to win this on our own. And we have a long history of building amongst communities from a wide range of perspectives. I think when it comes to white communities in the United States, yes, absolutely. There are ways in which white folks, particularly poor white folks, are central to these multiracial coalitions, but their role is also different. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough. In building alliances and building coalitions, everybody has a role to play. And everyone has a role to play because of their specific and unique conditions that when brought together, right, you are stronger than the sum of your parts. The thing that I think has to happen when we start to bring white communities into these coalitions is that, yes, absolutely, we are aligning around poverty. We are aligning around lack of access to the things that we need. But we also have to align around anti-racism. We also have to align around wanting to weed out white supremacy and white nationalism from our movements, right? And from our country and the way that we're governed. And too often those things get left behind or get left to the side. And there is such a push to say, well, what are all the things that are common about us, right? That we forget that it's where we are different, that the people who don't want us to be powerful, they lean into our differences, but we don't lean into our differences. And that means that it provides an opportunity to divide us.
Alaa, Alicia, thank you very much for your time and insights you shared with us on how change happens on the ground. We could not have had a more fitting conversation as a kickoff to a series of sessions tomorrow, from speaking to an artist who works with space agencies to colonize the language they use in order to see alternative and different development paths, to the doers from the edge who build new economic paradigms from science fiction literature, who build new regenerative economies with bacteria, who reimagine our relationship with technology to empower small-scale farmers to produce sustainable food. We look forward to all of you joining in these conversations tomorrow. Please don't forget to register at innovationdays.co. Thanks again and see you soon.